A man rides a motorcycle in circles around a peaceful rally in Pennsylvania, gunning the engine to drown out the meditators. A woman in Flushing gets shoved 3 times for handing out leaflets. A retired teacher in Ohio emails his senator about forced organ harvesting. Minutes later, his own phone is sending his wife messages in Chinese with a picture of Mao Zedong attached. None of these people are in China. They're living in New York, Georgia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and California. And they're American citizens and green card holders. And the reason all of this happened to them is the same. They practiced a meditation discipline called Falun Gong, or Falun Dafa. And Beijing has decided that that's not allowed, even in the United States. Today marks the 26th year that Falun Gong has been persecuted in mainland China, which started in 1999. And a recent study conducted by the Falun Dafa Information Center on 1,000 US-based Falun Gong practitioners showed that the extreme level of transnational repression is happening on American soil. Now, Falun Gong, or Falun Dafa, is this meditation practice that came out of China in the early 1990s. And the slow-moving exercises, sort of like Tai Chi, is wrapped around a moral principle of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. Now, this is not political by any means. There's no hierarchy within the practice. It doesn't collect fees or membership pricing, and it doesn't run for political office. But within a decade, the practice spread around China. It had tens of millions of adherents inside just mainland China, and of course then throughout the rest of the world. By the CCP's own estimate, there were more people practicing Falun Gong than the Communist Party members themselves. And that not any doctrine is of course allowed besides the communist one in China. So a massive movement that the party couldn't control, didn't create, and was nowhere near as people being loyal to as they were to believing something that came from within the heart was definitely a threat to the Communist Party. So on July 20th, 1999, Beijing launched a full extermination campaign. Hundreds of thousands were detained, documented death from the abuse, as well as forced organ harvesting. And there's now even evidence suggesting that many were actually killed for their organs, and the precise method of execution is the organ harvesting itself. So practitioners of Falun Gong scattered around the world in response, and one of the things they built was called Shen Yun Performing Arts. I actually did a video investigating Shen Yun. I was invited into their headquarters, so check that one out. This is a classical Chinese dance company, and it's based in New York. And they were built to perform the culture that the CCP tried to erase, China before communism. Now there's 8 companies that tour around the world, and every year there are sold-out shows around the world. So it comes from probably one of the most visible target for the CCP for decades-long campaigns of persecution, of fear, and of transnational repression. And what we're seeing now is seemingly the culmination of what they want to do next against the group. Now, for years, the assumption among Falun Gong practitioners was that once they escaped from China in the West, that they got out. And that was the whole point of getting out, right? It was just that they could escape from the persecution. And then, according to leaked accounts from CCP insiders like Yuan Hongbing, in 2022, Xi Jinping told his people that the global campaign against Falun Gong had failed and that it was being too cautious, too old-fashioned, insufficiently creative. And he basically ordered them to fix that worldwide. And the particular attention to the United States, we can guess why, because the US is China's #1 enemy. And the reported instructions were something very specific, using law warfare or lawfare, meaning to bury targets in nuanced lawsuits until they run out of money and to discredit them, using disinformation running through accounts and journalist outlets with no visible footprints or fingerprints or trails, any way you want to call it, back to Beijing. And Shen Yun was named directly as a priority target for sabotage. And this tracks with something that surfaced back in 2021, which is a leaked internal appointment letter naming a director for something called the Joint Office on Combating Falun Gong in North America. And this joint operation runs out of the Ministry of Public Security and the Ministry of State Security, which essentially are like the intelligence service and the police system. It's not a metaphor here, but it's an actual office that they've set up with officials promoted through the ranks whose job is to specifically run this place, a campaign on foreign soil to target Falun Gong. You don't set up a deputy bureau level office for your problem that you've already solved. This was clearly a headache for the CCP. And according to the information that was collected by the Falun Dafa Information Center over 7 months, they surveyed 1,000 practitioners across the United States. And from the reports they gathered, it came from 41 states. And of the 41 states, 30 states had reports that contained experiences with transnational repression. So this cleanly lines up with the 2022 timeline. Hear this. So nearly half of the respondents, about 48% of them, say that they've experienced some form of transnational repression in just the last 4 years. And the researchers pulled together more than 600 documented cases going back to 2020, and the case reported in 2025 were more than 10 times what they were in 2020. Starting right around the year that Xi Jinping allegedly gave the order, this ramped up. So all this tells you that the harassment isn't just following the population, it's showing up wherever it's very useful for the CCP. So cases of physical assaults, vandalism, verbal harassments, online, direct violent threats, bomb threats, mass shooting threats, death threats, pressure campaigns through relatives still living in China, surveillance, which is sophisticated enough that people were getting phone calls by name from officials or workers in Beijing that are tasked to scare and coerce people overseas. Chinese government entities themselves, the Ministry of Public Security, the Ministry of State Security, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they were directly tied to about 138 of the incidents involved. Over 60% of those victims are US citizens. 70% of them hold a bachelor's degree or higher, and over a third have a master's or doctorate. About 88% of them are ethnic Chinese, and the remaining 12% are white, black, Hispanic, Middle Eastern, Native American, Native Hawaiian, other Asian groups, or mixed race. So if you want to understand why Shen Yun in particular would receive so much attention from Beijing, look at December 11th of 2024. That morning, nearly identical emails arrived at the theaters in Atlanta and San Jose. Both were written in Chinese. Both threatened to shoot everyone inside if the theater if Shen Yun performed. And no gunman ever appeared, of course, but that almost is beside the point, because a threat like that to force the venues to increase security, evacuate the audience, it scares people, and it really shifts the headline from why is this company getting bomb threats? Are they dangerous? And so the attacks don't have to be successful. It just needs to become very expensive, and it needs to be time-consuming for those involved. So again, this is not limited to just bomb threats. Performers say that their tour buses have been vandalized, tires slashed, that they always almost require around-the-clock security on the buses. One Costa Mesa police report documented a 7-inch slash cut into a bus tire, made so that it wouldn't fail immediately, but later on the freeway, so that it can crash the entire bus. There's also the quieter pressure. Chinese consulate officials have repeatedly contacted theaters and local officials, urging them to cancel performances in the US and everywhere around the world. In one case documented by the Jamestown Foundation, a SUNY campus that had hosted Shen Yun for a decade declined to renew its contract shortly after signing a partnership with a state-run dance academy in Beijing, one that included ideological screening requirements. Now, here's the part that really should be worrying for people. Most of the pressure isn't coming from people you could realistically prosecute or foreign agents. According to the survey respondents, they identified CCP-aligned proxy groups, most notably the Queens-based China Anti-Cult World Alliance, and its chairperson has a criminal record for assaulting Falun Gong practitioners and has been linked in reporting to the CCP's anti-Falun Gong apparatus. One associate reportedly paid people $20 an hour to protest outside libraries holding signs attacking the group. And below, there are also ordinary members of the Chinese diaspora with no documented CCP ties. After decades of state propaganda portraying Falun Gong as an evil cult, some have acted on those beliefs themselves, shoving practitioners or shouting that they're a disgrace to China. And then you have American institutions that have never intended to be involved but are now involved. A parade organizer quietly removes Falun Gong after another organization company complained. A city council staffer telling a respondent, "I'm not going to go up against the New York Times." A theater simply decided that the controversy isn't worth it. None of those people are Beijing's agents, and they don't have to be. They just need to feel the pressure. The CCP doesn't need to control the American groups or organizations. It only needs to create enough doubt that these institutions exclude people on their own. So what brings us one of the most uncomfortable truths so far in this story is probably that since 2024, the New York Times has published several major pieces on Shen Yun and Falun Gong that rely heavily on a small group of sources, some of them with documented ties to Chinese state-run dance academy, without disclosing that connection. And they largely sidelined the decades of independent reporting on the persecution and forced organ harvesting of Falun Gong. They also ignored direct evidence that would contradict their reporting. What I'm trying to say is, I'm not claiming that the New York Times is a CCP asset, but based on some of the recent reports we've seen, that the CCP has cultivated, probably in decades, of ties with American journalists. This is according to one of the latest reports published by the White House. So what I'm trying to get to here is that America's most trusted newspapers are publishing highly one-sided accounts that align with Beijing's talking points. And Beijing doesn't need to do anything else. They just need to amplify the same reporting that they're feeding to these reporters. A Graphica investigation this year identified more than 40 fake websites impersonating outlets like the New York Times, the Guardian, and the Wall Street Journal to launder anti-Falun Gong narratives disguised as Western journalism. That's how the useful idiot journalism works today. Nobody has to bribe an editor. Publishing a misleading story about a persecuted minority and a state propaganda machine does the rest. Distribution for free. So let's just take away the politics for a moment. There's a Shen Yun conductor who's lived in America for 30 years but couldn't say goodbye to the grandmother who raised him because his family feared a single phone call could trigger detention in China. There's a woman in Queens whose grandparents in China received police visits whenever Falun Gong is mentioned during family calls. And then there's Chen Pei-ming, who we've discussed extensively, the first documented survivor of forced organ harvesting, with missing portion of his liver and lung confirmed through independent medical examinations. Since speaking publicly in the United States, his home has been reportedly broken into, his tires repeatedly slashed. One caused a freeway blowout, and his family in China has been pressured to denounce him publicly. He said that the CCP wants to kill him because he's the only living witness of the CCP's forced organ harvesting. And this is where we end the story, because despite the fact that everything else, 57% of them in this survey still say that they feel safe or somewhat safe practicing openly in the United States. And that's good because this country protects those fundamental freedoms. Most still believe that they're being protected by the system and that they continue to speak out in marches or in parades, and they're trying to run information booths. And that's what I think the biggest limitation to Beijing's campaign will be, that America's legal system still works and that this country protects those fundamental freedoms and they protect the little guys. But what the CCP is increasingly shifting to are softer tactics, media narratives, proxy harassment, institutional pressure, and those are sometimes below what the lawmakers could see. And so where the campaign does succeed is erosion. Where it fails is to recognize that there are fundamental differences between the two systems. And for those 1/3 of respondents say that they feel unsafe, especially those who survived the persecution in China and are returning to find that the patterns are emerging, well, the damage shows up in quieter ways. Emotional distress, friendships that fade away, venues that stop renewing contracts. And the question I had on my mind after reading the report was how many of them actually reported it to the FBI and how many more didn't really get to go public with this information. I reached out to the researchers and they say that the responses lacked enough detail to determine whether the incident had been reported, because many of the older Chinese immigrants really never learned how to deal with law enforcement the proper way. In China, there's really no proper way to do that, so they don't know how to do it. And so, if you went to the police in China, you become a target, and they're very fearful of doing the same here. And that's why I think where the report is missing is that somehow there's missing details on what people did. So within the additional sections of the report, it has a detailed step-by-step instruction on how to report these incidents to the local police, to the FBI, or even the Falun Dafa Information Center, so that they can curate and preserve these reports for future cases. And then also probably the most important thing is that, well, this is a test case, right? The same tactics documented here, proxy harassment, disinformation, amplified through legitimate media, pressure on universities and venues, and threats against the relatives back in China. They've all been used against Falun Gong, and they've been transferred to other groups like the Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hong Kongers, organizers of Taiwanese Americans, and Chinese dissidents abroad. So Falun Gong practitioners are simply experiencing it the longest, making their case the clearest record in the system. But if this can happen to one religious group, it can virtually happen to every other one as well. Leaving China doesn't necessarily mean that Beijing leaves you. And the persecution simply changes a form, right? It goes from direct threats and violence to intimidation, a bomb threat, slashed tire. And somehow you feel like this is not where it's supposed to be. So after 26 years, I hope the persecution ends today. And I hope that the CCP is held responsible for everything that is committed. All of the atrocities against not just Falun Gong, mainly Falun Gong, but also other groups and various groups are probably hoping for the same day to come as well. Thank you very much for watching this episode. Hope you enjoyed the content. Let me know your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to David on China for more. And thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.